What follows in this recording is an account of Socrates, the life and philosophy of Socrates, according to A.C. Grayling, from the book The History of Philosophy, which has been claimed as, since Bertrand Russell's account of it, a history of giving an account of the history of philosophy, has been claimed to be the best of what we have in a book form of the history of philosophy since Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. This book was published in 2019, first published in 2010. Here it is, A.C. Grayling's account of Socrates. The reason I'm recording this is because I was just listening to a video on the categories, or the predicables, the 5 words, or the predicaments as it is known in Aristotle's metaphysics, by which Aristotle's endeavour to understand and seek understanding of, and ultimately understand all if possible. That was his aim. Obviously he fell short. Everyone has ever since and ever before. For anyone to truly understand all it is must thereby be God. However, that was what he set out to do, and he definitely got closer and achieved more than pretty much anyone ever has since or prior. And I was just thinking how ironic it is that Socrates was acclaimed. You could define the word just. You could say Socrates was just, and therefore just is a predicate of what Socrates is an element, a derivative of what just actually is. He is an offspring of what is defined when we define anything as being just. Yet, how ironic it was that Socrates was literally sentenced to death for the fact that he was claimed and said and deemed to be unjust by the people who actually forced him to and ruled him to be unjust, and thereby had to have to drink hemlock, and sentenced him to death. The people who, in the guise of justice, who in the back then were the authorities who held the jurisdiction of justice in what they conceived of it, yet they were so flawed and literally were unjust, but because they were the law, the just, in the eyes of the authorities and the powers that be at the time, were able to sentence and had the authority, jurisdiction, power to be able to sentence Socrates to death and force him to drink the hemlock for being unjust, whereas literally anyone can ever see and has ever known, or has anything that has been spoken of and agreed upon as being what Socrates truly was and how he lived and what he did and what the man stood for, would be simply could not disagree that he was in fact just. And yet he had to drink hemlock, and he did so, even though, and I was just wanting to know the account of the apology, which is actually that's the speech which Socrates gave in his own defense at the trial, prior to which he was then sentenced by the people who claimed that he was unjust, forced him and sentenced him to death. it's fucking hilariously, it's absurd, but it's, you know, we're always at this, we to be part of a society in which we are ruled by a law, and the law givers, who are the authorities and the people who hold the power and jurisdiction, as being the people who are in charge of the decisions made upon which they claim to have knowledge of as the law, which then we are all ruled by, must live in accordance with, and must adhere to. And if we do not, will be in their eyes unjust, and thereby we can be sentenced or punished for having trespassed or broken or not adhered to the law, and thereby being unlawful. It's hilarious and absurd that the very people who claim to have ultimate knowledge and believe what they proclaim as being the law, to even understanding what that law is, and that it's in accordance with the truth of what true justice is absolutely hilarious when you see how many manifestations and ways in which that very justice by which they claim to be and embody and hold jurisdiction of has been actually, can so easily be deemed to have been unjust or flawed or hypocritically ironically, paradoxically perceived. It can and has been perceived and might be perceived as having been the absolute opposite of what they so claim throughout history, in the many different societies and rulings and jurisdictions and empires that have had the authorities claiming to be the rulers and the arbiters of justice. Anyway, so this is Socrates' story as according to A.C. Grayling in his History of Philosophy. Socrates is a character in Plato's dialogues, portrayed as the paradigm of the philosopher, disinterestedly pursuing truth, keen to promote clear thought, deep understanding, and knowledge of virtue. So that was Socrates' intention for why he was how he was. He is portrayed as loved and admired by his friends and the young, as kindly and witty, and as ferociously clever. Note that this is just me adding this. He says that he is portrayed as loved and admired by his friends and the young. Remember, one of the things that people who forced Socrates, sentenced him to death and forced him to drink the hemlock, accused him of and found him guilty of, was corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens. He is portrayed as loved and admired by his friends and the young, as kindly and witty, and as ferociously clever. Yet he was deemed to have been guilty of corrupting the minds of the youth. I'll go on. But Socrates is also the name of a real human being, and the great question, the Socratic question, is how far Plato's dialogues actually represent the historical Socrates. Obviously, because all we have to go of understanding or knowing anything of Socrates' life, and the events of his life, anything at all about Socrates, we have only by way of Plato's accounts of him in Plato's writings, because Socrates never wrote anything. All he did was go around Athens speaking and talking and engaging in dialogue, which is and questioning people and things. And so all he did was philosophize. He didn't write. There can be little doubt that the Socratic method, the method of questioning, dialogue, and cross-examination, was indeed Socrates' way, and there is no doubt that his chief, indeed almost exclusive interest was ethics. But how much of the philosophy in Plato's dialogues is Socrates' philosophy, and how much is Plato's? The probable answer is that Plato's early dialogues are, to a fairly large extent, representative of the historical Socrates, but by the middle dialogues, Socrates has become a literary device for the exposition of Plato's own views. I think what Grayling means there is that Plato used Socrates in his later works as being an example, an exemplar of certain qualities of a philosopher, or say wisdom, or say inquisitiveness. These were qualities which clearly were and evidently Plato understood and knew and could most define and perceive and sort of conceive of as being qualities by which Socrates most exemplified. So therefore he used Socrates in these later works as a figure for which he could then relate and represent what he was trying to say in the form of an example. Socrates was born in Athens around 470 BCE and died there in prison in 399 BCE, having been condemned to death for impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. Although given every opportunity to escape, he chose to obey the law. He had been found guilty and condemned to death, so he dutifully drank the hemlock and died as his fellow citizens said he should. The chief sources of our knowledge of Socrates are Plato's writings and to a lesser extent those of another of his pupils, Xenophon, though their accounts of him differ somewhat. Just going back to the irony and hypocrisy and paradoxical like the absurd situation which he found himself in, thereby having to and deciding. So although given every opportunity after he was sentenced to death to escape, he chose to obey the law. He had been found guilty and condemned to death, so he dutifully drank the hemlock and died as his fellow citizens said he should. Because Socrates, the reason he chose to drink the hemlock when he had every opportunity to escape and to flee Athens and to potentially live on and not have to, he had every right and every opportunity, the freedom to be able to escape and not thereby have to succumb and submit to the death sentence he was given. He chose to drink it because he claimed, and we'll see soon in his apology, which is the speech he gave in his own defense at the trial, and by which he reasoned and proclaimed his reasons for why he was actually he chose to drink the hemlock and stay, was that his whole life, his entire life was spent in Athens, and his entire life was devoted to the nurturing of and fostering of a sense and an understanding of truth in the citizens of Athens. He loved the city and the town and the people of Athens, and so he spent his entire life in devotion to attempting to uplift them and improve and enhance and assist them in coming to a clearer understanding, which is what he was as a philosopher, setting out and devoting his whole life to attempting to understand and helping others understand and questioning them, thereby in gaining a clearer sense of what it is, what it means, and what true understanding might even be, or truth itself. He was pointing out basically that the fact that he then drank the hemlock he was pointing out how absurd, how irrational, how hypocritical and how ironic it was that he was sentenced to death for being unjust and corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens. And so by not leaving and fleeing when he had the opportunity to, and staying and drinking the hemlock, that was his final philosophical, point that really sort of capped off his entire life and what he devoted his entire life for, which was pointing out truth and sort of by way of not claiming to know, but just simply pointing in the direction of, or pointing out flaws in other people's understanding, so that when he was sentenced to death by people who embodied the justice system and the authorities who had the ruling power to be able to sentence him to death for being unjust, he literally pointed out in that very act of drinking the hemlock how unjust and how ironic and how hypocritical they were, and how they literally were not at all just, even though they were in the guise of justice by doing what they did and claiming what they claimed by sentencing him to death. The chief sources of our knowledge of Socrates are Plato's writings, and to a lesser extent those of another of his pupils, Xenophon, though their accounts of him differ somewhat. For example, Plato, an urbanite, says that Socrates liked the town and disliked the country, whereas Xenophon, who loved the country, says the reverse. So obviously there's a little bit of bias in our accounts, in the differing accounts of Socrates, so as to what was claimed and written down by Plato and Xenophon. However, it's pretty well established that the essence of, Socratic philosophy and what he was about and his life and what he devoted himself to is undisputed. There are also reports of him in Antisthenes, Aristippus, and Aeschines. He figures as the butt of jokes in Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds, and in half a dozen other satirical plays. He was consistent in his principles, showing courage in battle and dedication to his mission to persuade his fellows to think seriously about the nature of the good and worthwhile life. The famous or infamous Alcibiades, a handsome statesman and general who was at last the downfall of his own city of Athens, claimed to be in love with Socrates and to have tried unsuccessfully to seduce him. Although Socrates was married to Xantippe, unkindly alleged to be a shrew, he was not without an interest in beautiful boys, an acceptable proclivity in his day. Very strange. That was an aspect, and reading history, there are some very strange, views and things that were accepted, culturally acceptable things. There still are. In fact, there's probably many more today than there were back then, though that was one thing that apparently was allowed to go on. Despite that, in the Charmides, he confesses to being flustered by the charms of the handsome boy of that name, but wished to talk to him to find out if he had that thing which is greater than physical beauty, namely, a noble soul. A famous story has it that when a man called Chaerephon asked the oracle at Delphi who was the wisest man living, the oracle said, Socrates, and that Socrates was astonished to learn of this, until he realized that it was doubtless because he knew that he knew nothing. Again, paradox, irony, hypocrisy embodied. Yet seems to be an element at the underlying wisdom itself. Any wise claim can be conceived of paradoxically in its opposite, or something that might refute and almost point out that it can be viewed in another, or deemed truthful in another oppositional sense of the term. He did, however, see himself as a glad fly, stinging his fellows into reflection on questions about virtue and the best kind of life. There are no reports of Socrates having written anything, though he is said to have co-authored or anyway contributed to some of the plays of his friend Euripides. As noted, it is plausible to think that the early dialogues of Plato give a fairly accurate picture of the real Socrates in both manner and opinions, but that by the middle and later dialogues, Plato's own philosophy comes to the fore, and the Socrates who appears in them is his mouthpiece, and in some cases not a leader of the discussion, but merely a participant, and indeed occasionally a defeated one, as in the Parmenides. So again, what I was attempting to highlight before, saying that in Plato's accounts of Socrates, which is the main understanding of what we now have of depictions and historical anecdotes of what Socrates was, how he lived, who he was, what he was about. Earlier Plato's writings seem to give true accounts of the historical depictions, and then his later ones seem to just simply embody and sort of almost characterize Socrates as a he can refer to as Socrates by what he prior wrote about and displayed of what he actually, the man who he truly was, and then refer to him and just sort of by saying, for example, there was a wise man, and his wisdom was of the kind almost like Socrates, and then so by him referring to Socrates in that sense, we are obviously to assume and have already previously understood of what Socrates and wisdom might mean when it is used in that sense of what Plato wrote about him prior in giving a true historical account of the man. Perhaps the most accurate portrait of Socrates occurs in the Apology, which is the speech given by Socrates in his own defense at his trial. That this work accurately reports his speech in all main respects is very likely, given that its contents would have been public knowledge and still in the memories of many when Plato published it. Moreover, Plato says that he was present at Socrates' trial, a claim that could have easily been challenged by contemporaries were it untrue. If Plato had been prone to invent significant things, he would almost certainly have claimed to be at Socrates' deathbed, but he reports that he was not there that day because he was ill, and that he only learned at second hand about the conversation between Socrates and other friends on that fatal day. He's got an asterisk here, and he's got a little thing that we should in reference to that previous the conversation that occurred between Socrates and other friends on that fatal day. He says here, the works by Plato which relate to the trial and death of Socrates are Erythro, Crito, Phaedo, and Apology. Those are the four works which which are related to and speak about the trial. Near the Agora of Plato's time, as one visits it in Athens of today, one can see the outlines of the prison where Socrates was kept and died. He had a bath on the day that he drank the hemlock. Only one of the cells in the prison had a bathroom attached, also visible in the outlines of the foundations. One can therefore stand on the likely spot where these signal events took place. For those who are moved by such things, the place is a considerable prompt to thought. Of course, because when you're actually standing in the actual real place where these historical events, which is now so famously embedded in the history and the very beginnings of Socrates, of philosophy and Western thought itself, and the history of Western understanding and logic and language and the English, everything about the Western mode of Western history. This is the very beginnings of its language and its understandings and conceptions and ideas, and everything stems, really, so much of it is predicated and dependent upon what these early Greek philosophers conceived and came to understand and sort of first thought and philosophized about thereby. Anywho, we'll go back. So I'll just repeat that last one. So, if Plato had been prone to invent significant things, he would almost certainly have claimed to be at Socrates' deathbed, but he reports that he was not there that day because he was ill, and that he only learned at second hand about the conversation between Socrates and other friends on that fateful day. I think that this further suggests that Plato was not in the close circle of Socrates' acquaintances. He would have been at Socrates' side on the day of his deathbed, had he been so, however ill. despite, the fact that he was ill. Socrates was a man in his 70s when he died, Plato in his 20s. The dramatic dates, so to speak, of many of Plato's dialogues predate his own birth. He never places himself among those present at those conversations. Which again, this supports the we can then assume and believe and consider that Plato's account of Socrates and the truthful nature of what he reported in the history of the events that took place, we can sort of be led to believe more so and trust Plato's interpretations of those events more so because he was honest in claiming that where he was and where he wasn't, and he wasn't claiming to have been at all of these things, but he was simply giving an honest account of what he saw and heard and was thereby understood of these events that took place, and what he might have then heard from the other people who were present at the trial, or not the trial. He was present at the trial at the drinking when Socrates had to drink the hemlock when he did drink the hemlock at the ending of his life. There was a bunch of people. There's a famous artwork there. It's understood there was about 12 other of his friends were there present at the time. Socrates was a man in his 70s when he died, Plato in his 20s. The dramatic dates, so to speak, of many of Plato's dialogues predate his own birth. He never places himself among those present at those conversations. In short, the personal connection between them was likely the same as between a professor and the majority of university students who attend her classes. He was, however, an exceptionally gifted such student. Taking it that the various accounts and caricatures of Socrates indicate something about the man Socrates, and that Plato's early dialogues give us some insight into the views and methods of Socrates, the philosopher, one can venture an account of him as follows. Remember that the Athens of Socrates' lifetime was the Athens which had been triumphant as a leader of the Greek world in the war against Persia, and had become wealthy and powerful as a result. It was the Athens of Pericles, who had used the tribute from the states in Athens' new empire to adorn the city with beautiful temples and statuary, and to sponsor the arts. In this high point of classical antiquity, the great ideal was beauty, not least of the male form and face, and the social and political skills acquired by an education at the hands of leading sophists, skills that would lead to fame, honour, riches and influence, and a high position in public service. Socrates was, in his person and manner of life, in effect a rejection of all this, and thereby, like I was saying before, Socrates was ironic in his way of going about pointing at truth and leading people into understanding by simply pointing out what it was not, and pointing out the flaws or paradoxes or sort of ways that it might appear but can be then refuted and held to actually seen in the opposite sense. So he was like a walking paradox who helped people gain clearer understanding of truth by literally pointing out the paradoxes and flaws in what they might have already previously held to be truthful assumptions. He was a rejection of all this. He was famously ugly, with bulging eyes, a big snub nose and thick lips, a burly frame, an indifference to dress and personal cleanliness, and he had strange habits, such as standing in a trance for entire days, lost in thought. He did not seek public honours or position, though he fought with notable courage alongside his fellows in the wars. He therefore stood out, an anomaly, an eccentric, all the more so for incessantly asking questions and confusing his interlocutors when they tried to answer them. One such, Meno, in the dialogue named for him, after his several attempts at a definition of virtue have been refuted by Socrates, says to him, "You are like a stingray. You have numbed my lips and tongue. I don't know what to say." To which Socrates replies, "Good. Now that you know that you don't know what you're talking about, we can begin to make progress." I'm sure that he didn't have an actual English accent like I just put on in my portrayal there. However, it was the Socrates of poverty and indifference to worldly things who was imitated by the cynics later. It was the Socrates of dedication to thought and fidelity to principle which inspired the Stoics later. It was Socrates' preaching of the considered life which inspired Aristotle to see reason as the distinguishing characteristic of humanity, and practical wisdom, pronesis, as the basis of ethics. And of course it was Socrates whom Plato took as his point of departure for a philosophical achievement of enormous range and influence. The first thing to note about Socrates as a philosopher is his method, the Socratic method, known as elenchus, or refutation. It proceeds thus. Socrates asks his interlocutor for a definition of an important ethical concept such as justice, continence, or courage. He wants to be told what is the essence of, say, courage, that single fundamental thing that defines all courageous actions and people. He does not want examples or lists of characteristics that some courageous acts or people might exemplify and that timid or cowardly acts or people do not exemplify. Then, when a definition is offered, Socrates demonstrates that other things held by the interlocutor to be true are inconsistent with that definition. So he points out the flaws and literally keeps refuting what these people claim to understand as the definition of, say, courage, literally by pointing out what courage is not and what their definition might, how it might be refuted or held to be how it might be any flaws that might be in it that the person might not be aware of. A good example of the method is to be found in the Laches. Laches was a general in the Athenian army who knew of Socrates' courage in battle. Socrates fought as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman, in the Battle of Potidaea, and was in the army with Laches on the retreat from Delium. In a discussion between them about how to train young men as hoplites, the question of the nature of courage arose, and Socrates asked Laches to define it. Laches said, "Courage is endurance of the soul," by which he meant steadfastness. But Socrates soon shows him that not all forms of steadfastness are good. For example, when it is merely stubbornness or foolish bravado, or when it is displayed by a doctor refusing a sick patient's request for water when water would be harmful. So steadfastness cannot be the essence of courage. Another participant in the discussion is Nicias, an associate of the sophist Prodicus, whose technique of pulling words apart, that is, drawing fine semantic distinctions and logic chopping with them, is criticized by Socrates in this dialogue. Nicias offers a different definition, that courage is a form of knowledge, namely knowledge of the grounds of hope and fear. Laches objects to Nicias' definition on the grounds that it entails that we cannot call lions and other such animals courageous, to which Nicias in effect replies, "No, indeed you can't call them courageous, though you can call them fearless. These are not the same thing. You cannot call them courageous any more than you would call a human baby courageous who put its hand in the fire, for it is not courage when you are ignorant of the possibilities." This is a good point, and although Socrates says, "He has got this," from Prodicus, who of all sophists is considered the best puller to pieces of words, he does not disagree with him about it, but he does disagree that knowledge of the grounds of hope and fear is an adequate definition of courage, because, I paraphrase, hope and fear pertain to what lies in the future, but virtue applies to all times, and as courage is a virtue, it too must apply to all times and not just to future possibilities. So, Nicias has given only a partial definition, said Socrates. And there, like all the early dialogues, the conversation ends in aporia, which is another of Plato's works. Inconclusiveness, no definition having been found. It's not actually in aporia, which is a Greek definition for inconclusiveness, or not having revealed all of what the definition, and that it's not revealing all of the truth of the term as it might be defined. But at least the wrong or inadequate definitions have been exposed, and something has been learned along the way. So there's still, they're revealing aspects of the truth of what this definition of courage may be. Namely, that one is ignorant about the true nature of, say, courage in this sense, whatever this happens to be, and that therefore one needs to think about it more to get a full or complete understanding of it. Clarification and awareness of one's ignorance are good things. So to be aware of what one doesn't know, thereby is also can be a very helpful and way of conceiving and understanding itself, because you're understanding what is not an element or aspect, or what cannot be said of something, to be in alignment with how we might see it, conceive of the truth of a thing. So, for example, wood is not a property of glass, of something that what we know and can define as being glass, it's not wood. So therefore, that helps us in assisting in our understanding of what we know and can define and understand of what glass is, because we know what it is not. That's pretty much Socrates' entire life was all about that. Clarification and awareness of one's ignorance are good things, according to Socrates. But if the method of Elenchus is meant to lead to knowledge, it is not entirely satisfactory if it only ever produces knowledge of one's limitations, or awareness of what something is not. The central problem seems to be the Socratic quest for essential definitions. Does everything have an essence which can be captured in a definition? Is it not the case that some concepts apply when this or that subset of a larger group of characteristics applies, the subsets overlapping but not jointly and exhaustively constituting the essence of the thing? Consider courage on the battlefield, in the dental chair, in taking an examination for the 5th time, in living cheerfully among the creaks and pains of old age, in getting up every morning despite grief or despair. Is there one essence of all these manifestations of courage? In any case, on what grounds is it right to say that one cannot know what courage is unless one can give a definition of its supposed essence? The "I know it when I see it" response is a good one in many cases, and it might be that unless one in some sense had knowledge of a thing, one would not be able to acquire further knowledge of it, suggesting that knowledge in some degree precedes being able to grasp the essence of a thing, if it has an essence. Another version of this thought is to ask, do we not ascend to knowledge in general of something, say knowledge of dogs, by first knowing individual or particular instances of that thing, this individual dog and that individual dog? It's like, when people, this is a good example of what he was referring to there, is like when people ask, how can you tell me or explain to me the distinguishing features which are able to differentiate a dog and a cat? Try. It's not easy. It just has a quality of dog, and we just see it, and it's in our perceptions, in how we view and look, and what we have been led to believe is, of the species of dog and cat. But really, it's hard to explain what actually the distinguishing features are. As it happens, Aristotle said that this was indeed Socrates' method, an inductive method of moving from the particular to the general, or of inference by analogy from examples to the whole? If so, matters are less satisfactory still, given the intrinsic insecurity of inductive arguments. But there is also the sense one has, especially in the earlier dialogues, that Socrates himself is not entirely unsophistical. Take, for example, Laches' attempted definition, when he nominated steadfastness of being a quality and how he defined courage. He of course intended that to mean in the face of challenge, difficulty, threat, or danger. But his intention, that was simply the intention, and to be what was meant by his use of the word steadfastness in that context. But that obviously simply isn't adequate to be deemed as a solid definition of what he was trying to define of courage. Socrates refuted him by taking cases of steadfastness where these are not at issue. So putting it in a different context and then displaying how steadfastness was not an adequate word to determine in pointing to a definition of courage and using as a word to define and point to what a definition of courage might be, describing, and not an adequate adjective to even use. Socrates refuted him by taking cases of steadfastness where these are not at issue. The fallacy seems to be his, not Laches, a form of fallacy of equivocation made possible by refusing to consider the qualifications that nail down a general concept to a set of specific applications.